Welcome to Module 4 of our course. Module 4 is focused on the evolution of science, technology, and innovation policy in Africa. And we want to focus on three interrelated themes. One is the trends and rationales for STI policy in Africa. What are the trends in policy making, policy implementation in Africa? What are the rationales for STI policy in most of Africa? Some reflections on the nature of and actors in STI policy processes. And you recall we defined what STI policy is all about, the policy process, and emphasized the policy process as being non-linear, being circular, with various actors involved in different steps or at different stages. We'll then end this discussion of this module by looking at some of the challenges and opportunities for STI policy, how to improve policy making, how to ensure that the rationales for STI policy in Africa are relevant, if you want, that they focus on African STI policy focuses on African problems. So I want to just indicate before I go further that we have 54, or at least 54 African countries. There are different countries. We have one union, the African Union, and several, at least 8 or 9 regional economic communities. But Africa is diverse. Actually, Africa is a huge continent. You can put many continents into Africa. It's the largest space that you have. So we need to appreciate diversity. The African diversity of economies, ecologies, geography, diversity of cultures, diversity of policy cultures. By policy cultures, I mean different ways of making policies, different way of doing, of managing policy processes. And their STI policies are also different. So in this module, we just have a snapshot, if you want, really a general snapshot. We tend to generalize. And later on, we can start thinking, maybe as a part of assignments, to look at specific policy frameworks or specific countries or specific regions to identify their key features. So just note that in Module 4, we tend to take a general approach. We give some examples of national STI policy frameworks and cultures. So what are the general trends? One general trend is that an increasing number of countries developing STI policies based on the recognition that STI matter. Between 1995 and 2020, really a number of countries have invested in designing STI policies. In 1995, actually when I started working on STI policy in Africa, less than 10 countries had explicit documents dedicated to STI. That time, actually, most policies were on S and T, and in many cases on research and development. There was less emphasis on innovation. The policies were just around research, doing research, production of knowledge. There was very little emphasis on the application of that knowledge through technological development, through innovation activities on the ground to transform economies. By last year, at least 45 African countries have adopted S and T policies, and many of them ST I policy. Many countries today are increasing their focus on innovation as opposed to just S and T. I have the privilege of working with most countries, at least over the last the last 20 years, and many countries are putting emphasis on S, T, and I policy. And we can discuss those countries from around the continent. Some are actually doing their renewing their policies. For example, Uganda is reviewing its 2009 ST and I policy to modernize it to align with the Vision 2040. So the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation there is at the moment engaged in a policy process to modernize the STI policy. Botswana, where we are involved, there is a review of the 2011 research, science and technology policy to mainstream innovation considerations to deal with a range of institutional issues. South Africa, 2019 adopted a new white paper on STI, which is a new science technology policy framework, replacing the one of 1996. Zambia has a draft, maybe already in cabinet. Namibia, over the last 4 years, has been working to revise its research and technology policy to modernize it. Swaziland is done the same. Seychelles. So around the continent, you'll find many cases. In West Africa, I know that in 2017, 2018, the Gambia adopted the STI policy. Senegal has an STI policy framework. I've not, because I don't speak French, I've not read French, I've not looked at it. But what I'm told is that there's a modern policy framework there. It may not be comprehensive. Ghana has had an STI policy since 2015, 2016. If I'm not mistaken, the number of reviews of that policy, which some argue that that policy has just the innovation added into the title, but the innovation content, policy content, is relatively weak. So the point I'm making is that major efforts on the continent to design and adopt STI policy frameworks. One common trend in most of these policies, the new policies, is taking the national systems of innovation approach. So most of the policies that are being decided by African countries take the national systems of innovation approach, and some you have the concept written in there, and major efforts to use that conceptual framework to guide specific policies. Many countries trying to do this. And some actually at a very high level, the national systems of innovation framework has been adopted in Uganda. For example, Vision 2040 uses this concept explicitly with emphasis on how do you get the different institutional actors to work together. How do you deal with the innovation policy problems in the innovation process, as opposed to treating science on its own, technology on its own, and innovation on its own. I just want to emphasize that one trend is that most of these efforts, again, are reliant on external technical expertise, and that's why we think this course is important to build within our countries capability to understand STI STI policy and get into really managing STI policy processes so that the countries do not rely on external consultants and UN agencies, the World Bank, or just technocrats that you build, in fact, STI policy in whole of government, whole of society. So just a number of illustrative cases. I've had some of these, and they are from the regions where I know better. In Kenya, you have National Science, Technology and Innovation Act of 2013. Now, Kenya is a very interesting, it's an interesting case where you have legislation before policy. So you have what one would call a policy instrument, but there's no policy. And it's a very peculiar one where between 1998, at least, and 2013, various actors have been designing STI policy. There is a draft STI policy, but for a range of political reasons, in 2012, an act was, legislation was passed by Parliament very quickly. Actually, took less than half a day to get that act, and it was driven by certain interests. That act of Parliament has very little programmatic and policy measures. It's around creation of certain structures. It's a structuralist approach, not a programmatic approach. And to a large extent, it's based on this linear approach that you start with the research, technology, and innovation. So you have the National Research Fund, you have an innovation agency, then you have an NACOST. In my view, it's a very linear approach, and it's not guided. If you read the act, it's not guided by the national systems of innovation approach, and doesn't treat innovation as a process. Then I've already talked about Uganda, where a new policy is being designed and anchored on high-level political document vision 2040. Then Tanzania still uses its old 1999 policy. There's been some efforts to revise that policy. Just emphasis in the case of Tanzania is largely around technology policy, which is a very interesting, emphasis on research as well, but it's really around technology policy, dealing with the issues of technology assessment, technology foresighting, enterprise development. And it's also one that is also unique, is that one of the policies of the 90s that had gender considerations in there. In technology planning, technology development, that technology development must take into account gender issues. Southern Africa, where I'm based in the region that I come from Kenya. I've already made reference to South Africa. 1996, South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa adopted an explicit STI policy that was based on an R&D strategy that had been developed then. That policy was accompanied by a technology plan. And the interesting point about the South Africa policy process is that it took that long. You have a policy adopted 1996, and only 2008 you have actually a plan to a large extent to implement the policy. And this happens in most African countries, where you have a policy, and we know what a policy, STI policy is by now. And then it takes you it takes you in some cases 10 years to develop implementation mechanisms. South Africa in 2019, as I said, adopted a new white paper, and only last year and this year are implementation frameworks being established. Namibia, the first policy, research, science, and technology policy was adopted in 1999, and only in 2014 was an act to implement the policy established. In 2016, Namibia started the process of reviewing its 1999 research, science, and technology policy to align it, to align that policy, the old policy, to new development imperatives, to focus on innovation. But up to now, there is a draft policy, and because of political dynamics, institutional disarticulation issues, Namibia has not adopted a policy. So the point I'm making here is that the policy gestation periods in most countries are relatively long, from agenda setting to policy adoption or even policy review are relatively long. It takes, in some countries, more than 10 years to get a policy process, STI policy process completed. And within 10 years, many things have happened. There are rapid technological developments that have taken place. The emergence of new technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. So if you are still working with your old policy, reviewing your old policy, if it takes you 10 years, by the time you have a draft, the technologies have moved. The pool of scientific knowledge has expanded considerably. So these are issues that I've already referred to in some ways. The Polish rationales for most countries until very recently were around STI or S&T for economic competitiveness. A very old rationale that you invest in science and technology, or science, technology, innovation to make your economies grow and become competitive. But we now know that, in fact, for your economies to grow and in some cases be competitiveness, you don't require STI. The number of African countries that are have low levels of scientific and technological capabilities, but are the fastest growing ones. I can give you examples: Angola, Equatorial Guinea, DRC. Some of them have been, growth rates have been relatively high, 6-8% growth in GDP per annum. But these countries do not have scientific capabilities. And their growth has largely been around accumulation of financial capitals. You export of raw materials, low value materials, natural resources. So you can expand you can grow your economy with the limited investment in STI. But you cannot develop the economy. You cannot expand those social and economic capabilities, and you cannot engage in sustainable development without STI. You cannot address many of the problems, social, economic, and environmental problems without STI. But you can by exporting raw materials to China and elsewhere, just expand the economy. So your GDP will be high, but you will have very little development. What I sometimes call growth without development, and we've seen this in most countries. Then I think the other point to emphasize that STI policymaking very often is organized around events, around workshops, but not as a process involving all agenda setting, and has to do with different political economic considerations. Some because a UN agency has money, So a country gets into STI policy making, not because it has its own agenda, but it's driven by external resources, or is doing it because others are doing it, peer pressure and peer influence. A country gets in because it is part of a regional community where it's, STI policy making is fashionable. So you do it because others in your grouping are doing it. And very often this is around events with the no broad-based constituencies. And as we'll discuss later on, many of these policies rarely get implemented because very few people know about them. There's limited public awareness of the STI policy frameworks, and policy literacy is low. Even within government departments, people know you have a white paper on STI or a national STI Act, but they don't know what is in the Act. And these are people that are expected to implement them. So policy literacy. In this slide, which I've taken from a report which we did for the African Academy of Sciences, we look at factors that influence policy implementation, and I refer to some of those. Just lack of conceptual clarity, weak public ownership of policy process and the policy. So the challenges, again, I've referred to those. For many countries, and we need to appreciate this, these policy frameworks are outputs sometimes of academic exercises, outputs of technocrats in government with little, if any, input from civil society, from private sector and political actors. And we'll discuss the last module that without these key actors, you'll not get very much out of STI policy. We emphasized in module 2 that in fact STI policy is really political. It's not apolitical. You can't leave politics out of STI policy. Some of the most powerful policy instruments are actually decided by parliaments, by politicians. For example, your public procurement frameworks or regulations are the most powerful innovation policy instruments that you come across. During these times of COVID, the public procurement is the most powerful innovation policy instrument. And those who determine not just the design, but the use of that innovation policy instrument are largely politicians. And public procurement gets misused, abused in many countries. We are seeing, vaccines, wrong vaccines being procured because science is not deployed. Everything is left to the executive or a few politicians who influence protective equipment, wrong one, whatever, or even if you are dealing with other technologies. In some countries, public procurement is just misused, corruption, and so on. The point I'm making here is that if we take a holistic approach and we develop proper policy instruments through broad-based processes involving civil society, private sector, and key political actors, I think things will be much better. We'll be able to have implementable policy frameworks. I've already also made the point that in many cases you don't have implementation plans, or it takes very long to have implementation plans, plans with measurable outcomes. Recall we define the policy as about actions. Policy is not about statements of intent. Policy is not just what people say, but decisions. And to implement those decisions, you require plans with measurable outcomes. If a country decides it's going to spend 1.5% of its gross domestic product on research and development, you have a plan on how you're going to measure the attainment of that policy goal. Another challenge, I think, is one of institutional leadership in many countries. STI is either a small department within the whole structure of government, which is not respected, which is not well financed. STI policy is starting to attract political attention, but in many countries, you don't see that. The institutional leadership is lacking at both executive and legislature levels. So some countries have STI ministries dedicated, so a ministry or a department dedicated to STI, promoting STI policy programs, projects. In many countries, STI is hidden into another ministry, either higher education, and that higher education takes more prominence than STI. I know countries where the ministers or permanent secretary responsible for higher education, science, technology, and innovation are saying they spend most of their time worrying about bursaries, student fees, university strikes than worrying about the promotion of STI or implementation of STI policy. There are many other challenges that we will find. Let me end this slide by just suggesting the opportunities. I think the opportunities are that one, there's recognition that STI matter, that without STI, investments in STI, our countries will not achieve sustainable development, statements will not be realized, Agenda 2063 will not be realized, the SDGs will not be attained. So that's an opportunity, just recognition that you can count. Today, more than before, politicians talk about STI, even if they give lip service. In 1995, you found very few African presidents or politicians talking about the role that science, technology, and innovation play in development. Things have changed. So there is political awareness. Even at the AU level, you see this in decisions union, as we discussed in Agenda 2063, but you've also had summits dedicated to STI, and when we talk about the evolution of STISA, we'll go to some of those, where presidents have made decisions specifically to promote and or govern STI on the continent. So that's an opportunity. Increasing number of countries designing policies, we've looked at the challenges of those. But I want to end by emphasizing that it's going to require state capacity for STI policy governance. State capacity, people in government who understand what STI is, STI policy, just as we are going through. STI policy is not just about research. It's not about increasing money for research activities. It's more complex than that. Many complex policy issues. We need to broaden participation in STI, bring private sector. As you read from the literature and from your module 1 and 2, module 1 and 2, you note that innovation is largely driven by private sector. Although you have also public sector innovation, which we defined as innovation to improve public sector operations, produce new services by public sector agencies. But the development of new technologies to a large extent takes place in private sector. Think of vaccines. Who is developing vaccines? Is private sector. Who is developing all kinds of ICT technologies? The fourth industrial revolution, largely driven by private sector. And you can't leave, if you leave private sector actors out of your policy process, in many cases you'll not move. So private sector is important. We'll discuss again letter that most African countries, the links between public and private sector in STI, those links are very weak. Universities that are doing research or science councils doing research do not work well with the private sector industry, and therefore you have actually this this problem where research, we don't move from research to technology development to innovation. We get stuck with science or in science. Research is knowledge is produced, but it's not applied because the main actors in the economic space, private sector, industry, it is less engaged in policy making. Then we've also talked about accountability regimes at all levels, civil society holding government to account for not working on, not implementing policies. So this last slide is just to make suggestions on the opportunities and the way forward, which is around building state capacity for STI policy. And I think the courses such as the ones that the one that we are participating in now are, in my view, the way forward, so that you get people in government, in the private sector as well, in NGOs, to understand STI a bit better, so that we don't confuse STI with other things, and understand the role of policy in promoting and governing STI for sustainable development. And many opportunities. You'll read that slide, you have the slides. Many opportunities with SDGs, things to be done. I think just to end is a point we make in model 2 around STI policy instruments, that you have a wide range of policy instruments. You have economic policy instruments, you have regulatory policy instruments, you have soft policy instruments, you have a range of policy instruments. But in most countries, there's a tendency to focus on R&D and use instruments around financing of R&D. We don't look at regulatory instruments or soft instruments around public-private partnerships, for example. So what we are suggesting is to exploit this wide range of policy instruments, including implicit ones. If you remember again, we talked of explicit and implicit policies. Explicit ones that are designed deliberately to promote STI, implicit ones designed not with a focus on STI, but they can be used. For example, public procurement instruments. And you read from some of the recommended literature, such as Boras and Edquist, that public procurement is the most powerful innovation policy instrument. There are many cases where it has been well used, but in Africa we've not really recognized that you can use such innovation, implicit instruments to promote innovation. So that's the end of Module 4, and I look forward to discussing Modules 5 and 6 with you. Thank you.